the recording of Between the Buttons. Musical Reinvention and Keith Richards rises to the occasion. Part 2. The lyrics are edited for clarity, changing the sound of pop music. In Part 2, we leave the personalities behind to look at the era to understand what was happening and what made it so momentous. On the music to history scale, this podcast leans heavily towards the historical. Lots of writing on the Rolling Stones foregoes the context. In Part 2, we aim to fill that gap. In the 70s, the revered Lester Bangs had the Stones in his critical sight. He was irritated that by the mid-60s, they seemed to stagnate. To illustrate this, in 1966, they didn't spearhead psychedelia, but jumped on board. He said, "The Stones kept on being great, following the trends like the old standbys they had already become." Still, during their short history of making raucous, fast, and brutal music, they had changed the sound of pop music from the tidy, sparkling, and light records that populated the early 60s pop charts. Most of the music made in the 1940s and 50s is polite by any standard of comparison. The Stones deliberately used volume and speed in their sound to cause a kinetic reaction in their audiences. They are a dance band first and foremost. The music on Between the Buttons is less so. It was their first conscious attempt to deviate. The Stones' manifesto is towards distorting, loudening, destroying the state of sound as it reaches the listener's ear. They want music to make less rational sense and be an emotional experience. What Mick Taylor would encounter to his horror and mystification a couple of years later, a band that sounds awful, loud and unrehearsed, yet making brilliant records, is at the heart of Between the Buttons. A deeper story to tell. In part 1 of my review of Between the Buttons, I tried to show that there were 3 different perspectives, lives and influences that made the period 1966 to 1967 during the recording and release of Between the Buttons unique. Those are the Stones' 3 leaders, Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards. As we dive into part 2, it's always worth bearing in mind when we're trying to make sense of something, even if we gather all the available facts, all the histories, all the testimonies, that's not necessarily how it was. For one, there were also Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts, and the rest of who made up the Stones. And surely there are disagreements about what was really happening, what was important, what were the influences, the pressures. What was it that led to the creation of that album in the way that it was made? And what were the outside factors that impacted on how people looked at the music? Whether they thought it was current, fashionable, cool, uncool, not up to the mark, pushing new boundaries, etc. This ends up being filtered through our own time when we know what the repercussions were. But what we don't necessarily know is the inside story. What I'm going to try and do is to give a sense of what the inside story could possibly be, what the overriding priorities of these 3 individuals were, and how the interaction of their priorities, biases, emotions might have shaped an album that ultimately didn't seem to live up to the billing that they, and certainly not the outside world, hoped for. Reassessing Between the Buttons. None of the Stones really want to talk about it. Even Wyman, the most prolific Stones chronicler, doesn't. Among a scarcity of records and sources, the only real testament we have is the album itself, which makes it, in its way, the most fascinating Stones record of the period, and the period one of the most fascinating in the Stones' history. It's significant that the Stones don't have very much to say about it, even now. It appears to have been the first time the band faced a critical failure while experiencing serious and microscopic intrusion into their private lives. Back in 1967, the world judged that Between the Buttons fell short of what it was looking for. More telling is what it was not looking for, because it was a much more confident era than ours. The music on Between the Buttons is a little bit more neurotic than what the Stones had made before, a little bit more insular, a little less confident, a little more filled with a wickedly cutting humour and more anxiety. It certainly feels more natural to our time than the mid-60s, an age of bursting confidence, of leaving half a century of war, mass death, and economic chaos behind. In 2026, we find ourselves in an anxiety-ridden period, and we can relate to how Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones felt then. Their individual life experiences were not typical of their generation. Their rising to rapid fame and success in a society suspicious of such social mobility earned them plaudits from the young, but enmity from sections of older, more conservative generations. We can also see that the world that the record-buying public, mostly the young and liberal-minded, thought was coming into existence in 1966 never really materialized. So with that in mind, we can make a different assessment of how effective Between the Buttons really was. It's time to re-evaluate it, in light of the above and understanding that it may have been far truer to its time than perhaps an album like Beggar's Banquet or even Aftermath, albums of boundless confidence. Aftermath gave off a confidence of carefree hope. Beggar's Banquet reeked of a cagey aura of confidence that the world really wasn't a place one could be comfortable with, despite its possibilities. You could never know what might come around the corner. It might disrupt whatever it is that you think that you are going to do and achieve. This is a particular feature of Keith Richards' songs on the album, when he and Mick started writing on their own. Between those two states of hope and skepticism lies Between the Buttons. The counterculture and swinging London. In the second half of the 60s, there was a hope that there was going to be less repression, more freedom, social, political and other changes to remove the yoke of conservatism. This would occur from the ground upwards. Long before the world is a village of globalization, the emerging counterculture was espousing a global mindset. We're all young people across the globe. We are hope, attitudes and messaging. But there was also a mood in mainstream Britain and America that young people had become indulgent in drugs, sex and liberal thought, caught up in weird belief systems instead of focusing on real things. Soon, those two currents not so much clashed, but enmeshed and created a dynamic that by the decade's end left the change those young people hoped for behind. By then, there was a real sense that something had gone awry, of the never-achieved revolution, that yes, there's a sexual revolution, but really, it was only some legal and political reform. It was not an unleashing of free-spiritedness and mass moral transformation of large swathes of Western society. Backstreet Girl references the hypocrisy of Victorian morality in extramarital affairs still current then in British high-class society. Please don't be part of my life. Please keep to yourself. Please don't bother my wife. Don't want you part of my world. Just be my backstreet girl, wrote Mick Jagger. A liberation of the mind didn't happen either. Liberal, affluent people relying on drugs had been a post-war phenomenon in the way that it had spread, not just within the upper set, but also to the middle classes. This became darker and darker as heavier narcotics supplanted psychedelics and became increasingly available to young people and people with real problems. It spilled out of high society parties and residences to everywhere and onto the front pages. Miss Amanda Jones documents this very type of scene. Don't want to say it very obviously, but she's losing her nobility, Miss Amanda Jones. Up and up she goes, our Amanda Jones. Looks delightfully stoned. So when a number of events came along, starting with the Redlands bust in 1967, and including the Stones' infamous Altamont concert in November 1969, this sparked a massive backlash. There is no better example of the Stones getting caught up in the hysteria of a generational tug-of-war than Mick Jagger's absolutely stupid press conference remarks before the Altamont Festival. We're doing a free concert in San Francisco, December 6th. It's creating a microcosmic society that weekend, which sets an example to the rest of America as to how one can behave in large gatherings. Mick is a guy who's normally sharper than that, and far more cynical and suspicious, and yet even he got lost a little bit in the spirit of the age of Aquarius. Fifth Dimension captured the mood of 1967 with its radical optimism as they topped the chart in the spring of 1969. harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding, no more falsehoods and derision, golden living dreams of visions, mystic, crystal revelation, and the mind's true liberation. By the end of 1969, when Altamont happened, the Sharon Tate murders by the Charles Manson family, the Vietnam protests, the Berlin and Paris student demonstrations, the French general strike, and everything else that was happening around the globe, one has the sense that repressive conservative forces leapt on it as an excuse to smash any kind of new social order emerging. The demise of the counterculture. The powers that be said, this is nonsense. The free concerts, the hippie living, the sex and drugs, the university sit-ins, the protests. You guys are completely misguided and dangerous. We're going to punish you. We're going to criminalise you. In the same way we're seeing climate activists, anti-war and anti-unemployment protesters being criminalised ludicrously at the moment. The paranoia that Mick, Keith and Brian started to sense personally in 1966 began to permeate wider society by the early 70s and finally erupted after Watergate. In connection, Keith Richards gives vent to these fears. Everything is going in the wrong direction. All I want is to get back to you. My bags get a very close inspection. I wonder why it is they suspect them. They are dying to add me to their collection, and I don't know if they'll let me go. At the same time, the conclusion of the Vietnam War in the mid-70s, achieved ironically by all of these protests spreading to so many people who had skin in the game, either theirs or their children's, ended a natural flashpoint between disaffected young men and the US government. But much more crucially, economic conditions worsened and self-interest replaced the hippie communal spirit. With less wealth, poorer outlooks, the tolerance for idlers and idealists almost vanished overnight, while the more commercial aspects of hippiedom were co-opted by commercial industries. Social change became a luxury, and young people were told to make the best version of themselves from what there was. This rapidly changed the we decade of the 60s to the me decade of the 70s. The message was, we can give you a better quality of life if you make the most of yourself. The messaging turned very quickly in mainstream Western society in the 70s. Society wouldn't carry anyone, and you had to self-realise. By the mid-70s, personal development seminars had replaced communes as the buzzy thing in Middle America. The Kinks' 1965, A Well-Respected Man, a mocking send-up of conventional existence, could almost be the theme song for what conservative forces were dreaming of. 'Cause he gets up in the morning and he goes to work at 9, and he comes back home at 5:30, gets the same train every time. 'Cause his world is built around punctuality, it never fails. And he's oh so good, and he's oh so fine, and he's oh so healthy in his body and his mind. He's a well-respected man about town, doing the best things so conservatively. A generation's voice through pop. Social messaging in popular music had developed from the early 60s as young people's engagement in the world's current affairs changed from passivity to engagement. As the wartime and post-war generation of young people came of age in the mid-60s, they realized the world was not as it had been painted by their parents. Among the voices they trusted the most were pop stars who were their peers. Popular music changed from being just entertainment or a playlist for personal tastes to become the mode of expression for a mass of young people to challenge established ideas within society about social organization, politics, economic and gender roles, national identity, sexual identity, and cultural heritage. In the era of television, the civil rights movement, and eventually the Vietnam War, they began to see the disconnect between the ideas bred into them as kids and the reality of life in the United States, Europe, and around the world. They started asking awkward questions such as, if the United States was a shining example of freedom and equality, then why were African Americans forced to struggle so hard for the right to go to certain schools, to drink out of water fountains, or even cast a vote? Is this global struggle against communism worth the cost of shipping young people halfway around the world to kill and be killed in a country few Americans knew much of anything about? In the era of sex, drugs, and pop revolution, but also of anti-war protest and inner-city riots, The more the young pushed forward, the more the so-called adults pushed back, becoming a pattern of the 60s. In 1966, the year the decade exploded, John Savage describes a year that's still freaking out the establishment to this day. The pushback. In the summer of 1966, the most famous pop group in the world, the Beatles, came up against immutable forces. Right-wing protesters in Tokyo, the agents of President Marcos taking physical revenge for an alleged insult, and the Deep South's disc jockeys, incensed by John Lennon's comments about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus, organising boycotts, conducting Beatle burnings, and threatening the group's tour. Despite such clashes with conservative voices within society, what was thrilling about 1966 music scene was that it wasn't business as usual, a feeling that can still be heard in the records of that year. Music was right in the middle of this new youth, awareness growing and sparking debate in the public square in the West. Performers like Bob Dylan spearheaded his generation's cultural response on his early albums and gave voice to the concerns and dissent that was understood and shared by many of his listeners. Other acts, with large audiences in Britain and America, joined the chorus of civic debate. By 1970, just a year after The Age of Aquarius had topped the American pop charts, The Temptations' post-psychedelia masterpiece, Ball of Confusion, would capture the feelings of the many who were bewildered and exhausted after a decade that seemed to offer so much ended in despair, and previous election liabilities, Richard Nixon and Ted Heath, were elected in America and Britain. Ball of Confusion. Oh yeah, that's what the world is today. The sale of pills is at an all-time high. Young folks walking around with their heads in the sky. Cities aflame in the summertime, and oh, the beat goes on. Back in 1966, music was the equivalent of social media today for young people. It pushed against social boundaries and challenged the views of parents and grandparents. As the music market grew to meet the demand, so did the variety of styles, sounds and acts, creating what felt like a new paradigm in rock music. The Stones' competition. As Mick and Keith wrote songs for Between the Buttons, it begs the questions, how could the Stones dominate in a more fragmented musical marketplace? And was psychedelia a paradigm shift or merely a phase of rock? The Beatles and the Beach Boys started exploiting new studio technology in 1966 to produce stunning albums described as mini symphonies. The technical prowess of these albums was matched by Bob Dylan's synthesis of folk, country and blues rock genres on Blonde, while newer groups' debut albums pushed new boundaries through their inspiration from the visual and fine arts. Cream's first album established that psychedelia and blues could live side by side. Their look and sound was driven as much by art as by music. They also used instrumental virtuosity in their brand of psychedelia to inject pop music with serious artistic credentials on their own merits. In line with the Rolling Stones' early records, Cream declared that loud, distorted guitar solos were the future. The Who were less polished and more aggressive than the Stones. They tapped into a different group of disillusioned youth with a highly developed sense of streetwear. In Keith Moon, they had an eccentric but brilliant percussionist whose drums sounded very cool. The Jimi Hendrix Experience introduced a West Coast psychedelic jam style into British pop right at the moment when pop songs seemed to become elastic and opened up to all types of musical experimentation through the use of studio technology, tape loops, and guitar pedals. In a less technical and more down-to-earth way, the Kinks, thanks to lyricist and lead singer Ray Davies, became the celebrated and astute commentator of British social mores. Pink Floyd, another new act, introduced quirky humour and novel sounds to the mix, initially through their mercurial and madcap leader, Syd Barrett. Musical change was ever present in 1966-67, and like other established groups, the Rolling Stones faced a dilemma in knowing what musical traditions they were to keep and which emerging sounds they were to explore. Between the Buttons shows us they struggled with this question more than other British bands. Experimenting with psychedelia. In contrast, the Beatles changed their image and music fluidly compared to the Stones. Their progression from beat music to folk rock, to northern soul, and finally to psychedelia seemed effortless. Dylan's transition was the most spectacular during the 60s. This is another accepted aspect of the decade that the major artists were expected to transform their sound with every new single or album. So demanding was the pace of creativity. It's in this respect that we can read Banks' criticism as a feature of the rock scene at the time. Everything in the Rolling Stones' garden is very nice at present, but despite the heights of their appeal, they haven't got the staying power of the Beatles. Because of the changes in taste in popular music, the Stones cannot hope for lasting popularity. The very nature of their music precludes drastic change. It is difficult to see which direction they will travel in. Where do they go from here? That from Melody Maker in January 1966. 3 candidates for the best album of all time came out in '66: Pet Sounds, Revolver, and Blonde on Blonde. While the Stones' Aftermath was a milestone for the band, being the first album of all originals, it wasn't quite up there with the Beatles and Dylan's work. Speaking of Dylan, his kicking back at the folk crowd that heckled him in Manchester on his 1966 UK tour has always struck me as a point of inspiration for the Stones, to take risks while ignoring the critics that doubted them and fans that wanted them to remain unchanged. Maybe their audience didn't want them to change, but that was never an option they could realistically contemplate in a fast-moving music scene like London's in 1966-67. During this period, it was simply the cultural hub of the Western world. Accidental proto-punk. Like many of their peers in 1966, the Stones cautiously believed that things were about to change socially, politically, and otherwise. They tried to contribute to that change by making music that was transgressive and transformative, different from what they had done before and yet within the spectrum of their existing sound. However, they made significant changes to song structures, arrangements, and instrumentation, which made their new songs sound not as direct as their previous work. At the same time, the Stones' psychedelia often acted more as embroidery added to Keith Richards' riffing than a new unified sound to rival the explosive blues-driven rock and roll. This produced a rather schizophrenic album, which also hinted at the future path of rock music with its proto-punk sound. Astute changes. To me, the Stones' tinkering with their sound on Between the Buttons felt less forced than on their Satanic Majesty's requests. I believe the changes they made were a positive, but with mixed results, partly due to the band's own temperament and their natural skill set, and partly due to how successful other acts were in assimilating psychedelic music into their sound. The Stones sound wasn't always best served by psychedelia's layered instrumental sounds, Andrew Loog Oldham's unsophisticated production, and oblique nursery rhyme-style lyrics. Mother's Little Helper squashes a song like Who's Been Sleeping Here, both lyrically and musically. But the Stones' nasty side was always one of the hallmarks of their image and appeal. Softer music just seemed to detract from the point of their existence. The most successful songs in Between the Buttons parlay the band's previous brutal put-downs into acerbically humorous observations of the swinging London scene. Amanda Jones is a stellar Stones groove and a brilliantly absurdist study of the upper classes partying around London's clubs. With many of the songs on Between the Buttons lacking the lyrical, guitar-driven directness of I Wanna Be Your Man, Satisfaction, and It's All Over Now, it's no surprise that Ruby Tuesday stole the show in this set of songs. Not only was it a fully realised Baroque pop-folk ballad, but its lyrical departure from the tone of songs such as Under My Thumb suited the positive vibes of the times. Yet it is hard not to argue that Paint It Black may stand alone as the single best song from this era, combining a recognisable Stone sound within a psychedelic vibe. Here, the axis of the song is guitar and sitar instead of 2 guitars. Add Charlie's omnipresent pounding drum beat and mix insistent vocal, and this song works in the same vein as their previous hits. It would take the Stones 2 years to find the right balance between their traditional rock and roll and the new wave of sounds unleashed by psychedelia on their 1968 album Beggar's Banquet. In 1968, Pete Townshend observed, "I've heard one of the Rolling Stones tracks. Incredible, delicious, it's wonderful rock and roll, and well overdue from them. The Rolling Stones should always be a non-progressive group. That's what I dig about them. And there it is, the crossroads that the band had to successfully traverse in 1966 to please fans like Townsend. The tension between innovation and delivering a sound familiar to their audience. But this was not only a sonic challenge, but a lyrical one as well. We're not old men. By 1965-66, Mick Jagger, like the Impressionists provoking the classicist painters in 19th century France, was going to war with middle-class morality in his lyrics. We've seen a little of that already. On Something Happened to Me Yesterday, Mick poked the bear with barely concealed drug references. The bear would soon bite back in the form of the News of the World newspaper. Something happened to me yesterday. He don't know if it's right or wrong. Maybe he should tell someone. He's not sure just what it was, or if it's against the law. The definitive statement of the Stones' attitude, and by extension their generations, was of course uttered by Keith Richards in Chichester Crown Court in June 1967 to the prosecutor. We're not old men. We're not worried about petty morals. Where in life Keith is a lion, in art Mick is like a bird of prey as a lyricist. On Between the Buttons, you can spot his eye roving through the album as he hunts for suitable characters and subjects to revile, to ridicule, to rip apart in his effort to free himself and his generation from a stultifying social order. On yesterday's papers, Mick throws in his hat with the free love crowd against the do the right thing status quo. Who wants yesterday's papers? Nobody in the world. Seems very hard to have just one girl when there's a million in the world. All of these people can't just wait to fall right into their big mistake. That big mistake, as the old saying points out, a life without regret ain't worth living, was a key part of psychedelia. That youthful impulsiveness was expressed through improvisation and novel soundscapes in psychedelic music. Ruby Tuesday stands out. But among the various portraits on the album, who shines brightest as the defining character of this new generation that Jagger and Richards were fighting for? It's Ruby, not written by Mick, but by Keith and Brian. Ruby of Ruby Tuesday fame, she who lives for the moment, she who will not be bound by the bonds of history, social expectation, or personal recrimination. In the end, despite his valiant efforts to take an axe to middle-class morality, Jagger is outstripped by Richards and Jones, just as the trio reaches its fateful moment of dissolution. Ruby Tuesday would be the Stones' only top-charting track for nearly 2 years in America. The music on it is ancient and modern. Brian Jones was supposedly inspired by 16th century composer and lutenist Thomas Dowland and 1930s Delta blues maestro Skip James. In doing so, Jones creates a setting beyond history for a personality that is beyond definition. Keith is compelled to find a new vocabulary for this new kind of woman who not only demands freedom, but embodies it in a way never quite seen before. This is a woman who in the past would undoubtedly attract scandal, violence even, and suffer a bad end. In 1966, she'll most likely meet an ordinary fate, but one of her choosing. To catch her dreams before they slip away. A line that is more than a little Shakespearean in flavour. In doing so, Ruby invites us to share her liberty. Don't question why she needs to be so free. She'll tell you it's the only way to be. She just can't be chained to a life where nothing's gained and nothing's lost at such a cost. The attitude captured in this verse was extraordinary in 1960s Britain. It was still largely the convention to follow in your parents' footsteps in terms of careers and getting married to start a family before you had sex. And there were real expectations to be dutiful in your community and neighbourhood. This was mirrored and illustrated sharply in the mid-70s by the backlash Betty Ford faced to her modern attitude to her daughter's relationship choices. Ruby symbolised none of that. Her outlook was the extraordinary made ordinary. It's the story of history. It's the story of psychedelia. Privileges, once enjoyed only by the elite in British society, now flow down to grace those willing to seize their blessings. From privilege to human rights to law, And so the story went. The opportunities for those willing to stake their right to new liberties changed with every new day. Keith himself would soon show in court that he lived with the same daring as Ruby. Flamboyant libertines. From romantic poets such as the libertine Lord Byron and the early promoter of free love, Percy Shelley, to fictional Victorian detective Sherlock Holmes, using morphine and cocaine to dull the routine of existence, to 60s rock stars, the path of libertine Britain is both breathtaking and amusing. Quote, "It would not be too lazy an observation to make that the romantic poets of the late 18th and early 19th century were the rock stars of their day. By this, we mean proper rock stars, the scandalous and moral hedonists of the 1970s, whose legendary and real antics have gone down in history, not today's carefully marketed Instagramming facsimiles. For the romantic poets lived life with a devil-may-care attitude towards morality and acceptable standards of behaviour wholly in public view. They drank heavily, took hallucinogenic drugs, and had a slew of affairs. They even found time to write some poems along the way. The challenge of the hippie and swinging London generation to British society in the 60s was a continuation of a long tradition that was flamboyant, libertine, and emphasised private freedom over social obedience. The Rolling Stones' three leaders were visibly following in their artistic forebears' footsteps in the Romantic poetry movement. Yet despite this long tradition, they posed a challenge to the very buttoned-down attitudes of the British class system, just like their forefathers and mothers. Those who felt they were the guardians of this system marked Mick, Brian and Keith as targets for punishment, and it duly arrived in February 1967 with the drug bust. While the Stones came up against aggressive retaliation and struggled to incorporate new sounds to their blues-influenced rock, the Beatles burst through barriers of innovation with Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, with seeming ease while remaining in tune with the optimism of the mid-60s, and living out the flamboyant tradition with very little pushback in comparison, in Britain at least. In 1968, as the tide turned against free love, and the hippies' outlook and the youth movements turned towards a more confrontational stance, a switch was flipped, and the Beatles struggled to capture the moment, while the sneering aggression of the Stones' staple sound rebounded when combined with the grating edge of Dylan's folk-style garage rock. The shift to a return to basics from the more elaborate textures of psychedelia, parallel switch from idealizing 18th century romanticism to an embrace of a medieval pastoral, suited the Stones' arc of development to a T. Jumping Jack Flash channels the raw energies of the oppressed people of the Mississippi Delta with a hypnotic medieval British mysticism, as if King Arthur had been reborn as Arthur Big Boy Crudup, composer of That's All Right, the song that turned Elvis Presley into the king of rock and roll. Brian evolves. During 1966, we encounter the tension between traditional musical approaches and modern ones. Fighting for tradition is Brian Jones, while Mick Jagger is pushing for a more modernist sound and message. Keith Richards sits between the two, but would soon become the traditionalist. Brian wants the Stones to remain rooted in the blues. As the band strays further from their original inspiration, so did Jones' enthusiasm for the music they were making. On Between the Buttons, he all but gives up playing the guitar, an instrument central to the blues tradition. To keep himself relevant, he begins to master any instrument that falls into his hands. The credits on Between the Buttons show him playing 13 different instruments, including the mellotron, banjo, theremin, vibraphone, and trombone. On Ruby Tuesday, he plays the song's melody on a recorder to evoke Ruby's will-o'-the-wisp nature. This folksy type of psychedelia would prove to be a key ingredient in the band's future. The Stones would capture the same magic with a dash of devilry to huge success on the legendary Jumping Jack Flash and its B-side, Child of the Moon, in 1968. The Stones returned to the blues on Beggar's Banquet, and especially on Jumping Jack Flash, vindicated Brian's confidence that the Stones could succeed as a modern blues outfit. It inspired his last great turn on the guitar with his delicately measured playing on Mick Jagger's acoustic ballad, No Expectations. For a brief moment, the trio sit in a circle and compose a wondrously affecting ballad for the ages. Never Hippies. In judging Between the Buttons, its songs, music, and lyrics themselves, in the context of psychedelia and the summer of love, we return to the band's personalities. Because despite Mick getting infected by the Aquarius spirit, he's just not a hippie. He has stated that he is unable to write when in a happy frame of mind. While the music in Between the Buttons is approximately like the other sounds of 1967, Jagger's lyrics and his voice always contain suggestive barbs. He says, "The States give you a lot of energy. There's a propensity to make you very uptight in some cases, and you start to write complaining songs. Whereas like in some places in Europe, I can't write complaining songs because it doesn't give you that effect. You know, it gives you a feeling of being happy and sort of in harmony. In America, I rarely feel harmony, so you write songs that are sort of like jangling." That was Mick Jagger in 1967. Is it a surprise that he eventually moved to live in France? In 1967, Mick's lyrics were still motivated by the darker side of love, with relationships entangled in power games, deception, and unfulfilled desires. His message isn't that of the groups that thrived during the age of peace and love. A contrast to the Beatles' All You Need Is Love is Jagger's All Sold Out, a dark illusion of control, denial, and dismissal in either a love relationship or a professional one. I hope that you're having fun with me. There's not much left to attack. I hope that you're nearly done with me. You sold me out, and that's that. So, was the Stones' psychedelic period a pose rather than a genuine adoption of hippiedom? I'd say it's clear they never fully embraced the naive aspects of the hippie movement. What comes through with clarity is that while they were aligned with their generation's ideal of wanting a better and peaceful world, the Stones were less optimistic that the dangers of oppression were confined to places like Vietnam, the Middle East, or the inner city streets of America. They were acutely aware from their run-ins with authorities that those same dangers were just as real in London. In this context, Between the Buttons feels like more than a title. It carries a skepticism that the world can be changed by a message of peace and love. At times you can almost hear them sing, "Wait and see, nothing's been resolved yet." Equally, the Rolling Stones' fate was still hanging in the balance when the album was released in January 1967. Their use of pop and psychedelic stylings against the grain of their blues background led to what would later be called proto-punk. In summary, the Stones remained talented and innovative during their awkward periods. Besides, they clearly hadn't worked out how they fit in with the peace and love movement. In the absence of the Beatles in Monterey in June 1967, you might have expected the Stones to headline, but only Brian Jones made it to California that summer. Speaking of him, the Stones hadn't worked out how to deal with their issues with Brian. After their refusal to join other acts on the London Palladium's revolving stage in January 1967, resulting in the sacking of Andrew Loog Oldham, the group had to master how to present their rebellious image without their in-house Fleet Street mesmerizer. The sardonic humour that runs through Between the Buttons is perhaps their way of coping with feelings they find hard to express directly. Yeah, we're doing great career-wise, but otherwise we're too shit knackered to enjoy it. The who knows, where's the blow type feelings. The music and the personalities. But are the fault lines we see in the band during this period merely a personality clash between Mick, Keith and Brian? As each personality reacts with the other, are the results the full story of their work and life? Clearly, those are not the only factors at work, as we have seen the huge societal and generational forces at play during this period. But critically, built into those personalities were vulnerabilities that made things so hard for the Rolling Stones between 1966 and 1968. Jones was vain and lazy. Contemporary accounts testify to his erratic and unpleasant outward personality. His inability to respond to the writing partnership of Jagger and Richards was critical to his loss of power in the band. However, he didn't help himself with his descent into extreme alcohol and drug dependency. Jagger, in contrast, was always pushing forward without caring what the fallout was going to be, both in the studio and in his personal life. During 1966, he sought to lead the band but needed Richards, having decided that Jones was surplus to requirements. Richards, the hard-working heart of the band, was caught between his formative musical relationship with Jones and the long-standing personal one he had with Jagger and their creative partnership. In the end, it fell to Richards, as it did to Caesar's friend Brutus, to strike the critical blows. He assigned authorship of Ruby Tuesday to Jagger and abandoned Jones in Marrakesh when taking Anita Pallenberg back to London with him in 1967. It's this study of character, laying bare the interconnecting fault lines between the band's professional and personal decisions and the circumstances at the time, that lead to the untimely demise of Brian. Given the picture we've built of the band's politics, its working practices, and the expectations of music buyers, it's plausible that Mick, ever the one eager to stay relevant, was the driving force behind the making of Between the Buttons. This might then explain his later, frequent bitterness about it. If any theme can be discerned from the album, it is breaking free from the past, being hip and modern. Yet, as we know, it didn't work out. Not on the album, and not for the band. To some extent, it's not unreasonable to think that if Mick, Keith and Brian had not been busted for drugs in 1967, they might have sunk into irrelevance in Britain, having no meaningful hit between summer of 1966 and spring 1968. Only when the Stones returned to the traditions that inspired their initial music on 1968's Beggar's Banquet with their new notoriety did they finally achieve the status and success they had sought, and in so doing were able to carve out a unique place for themselves within popular culture and music. The role of the past. The past is a country that Mick Jagger detests. 60 years and counting, and we have yet to see an autobiography from the Peter Pan of rock stars. Yet his interest in music's past has been the source of his greatest successes. Set aside that he built a career from adapting a niche musical tradition originally created in the agrarian communities of the rural South of America. Just look at the content of Brown Sugar and its feel, which he said was based on a similar groove on Freddie Cannon's Tallahassee Lassie, an obscure 50s rock song. Jagger has more than a fleeting acquaintance with the past, but he appears to be immune to the nostalgia it creates and some of its lessons. That is his own personal conundrum. Luckily for him, in Keith Richards, he has a partner who is comfortable in exploring the past to utilize it for whatever he needs in the present. In his role as the Stones' musical director, at the height of their powers, Keith was able to steer the band safely away from the flamboyant but redundant trends of psychedelia to a longer-lasting and more significant music. Outside of that writing partnership, and without a stable role and the temperament to contribute to the Stones' original work, it's too tempting to see Brian as a doomed figure. Sometimes I see his key function as a sort of teacher-philosopher. In the beginning as an ally of Keith's, he was able to establish the band's sound of the dual guitar attack and the band's iconoclastic character, which has endured for over 60 years. As much as Mick Jagger has tried to alter the formula and the tradition that the band's formative guitarists created, it is indisputably the key legacy of the Rolling Stones. The Stones reject nostalgia. In cocking a snook at mainstream culture, at the white American traditions of rock music, and at the British social and legal systems, the Rolling Stones were undoubtedly provocative. But theirs was not merely a nihilistic rejection of traditional mores. Keith Richards' mocking riposte to the prosecutor in 1967, "We're not old men," can also be seen as the calling out of a nostalgic romanticism of the older generation, who have lost faith and interest in the present or the future. Keith was saying he was of his time and of the future, and what had gone on in the past was not going to bind him. There is a great truth in the idea that a society that is only bound in nostalgia for a glorious past is one that will ultimately implode. In our time, we see a foreseeable implosion happening, as the last 60 years have seen a return to an overwhelming love of the past, no longer thinking about the future realistically, but only hearkening back including, alas, to the glorious days of the 60s. Will we learn from Keith Richards' dexterous rejection of the past and his intelligent use of history as a platform to build our future? An establishment mirror. For young men like the Rolling Stones, who had lived through the horror and deprivations of the war and post-war era, 1966-67 was a period of optimism for a better life. Change was short-lived in many ways, as we've seen, but they did have a moment of opportunity, making art, creating a new culture and earning a living with it, all the while going against the grain of the establishment. These were young men, brought up in the waning days of the British Empire, a world that relegated them to the lowest rung, where they were ridiculed for wanting to be who they wanted to be. And so they struck back, in any way they could, with mockery sending up the very society that told them that they had no meaningful place, for they didn't feed the machinery of the state in terms of power, money, and weaponry. But if anybody had bothered to look closely at what was really happening in the 60s, they would have noticed that these young men had earned $8 million, over $72 million in today's money, by the time they got to the end of the decade, in a period when top tax rates for high earners were over 90%. They would have realised that the social power that pop music engendered, the cultural capital that the Rolling Stones had generated, swayed the British legal system in the end. You don't incarcerate people who produce this much income, investment, and influence. So for all the fact that both sides didn't respect, didn't trust, and certainly didn't have any intention to work with each other, there are startling similarities between what you may call the establishment and the 60s rock generation. They very closely mirrored each other. It should be no surprise then that so many have been ennobled with knighthoods. Prime among them, of course, Sir Mick Jagger. The psychedelic period is one of the richest periods in popular music. When it was the dominant style, it would have been career suicide for the Stones to ignore it in its British form, which was more whimsical, musical, and Lewis Carroll inspired than its harder edge, jam style, and acid influence variant on the American West Coast. Zone of comfort. So 1966-67 was a real hinge moment in the Stones' career. The band's three leaders had very dysfunctional relationships at this pivotal moment of rock music evolution. We've seen that the group weren't willing to face their flaws as people while trying to record an album that was out of their comfort zone. Instead, they pretended that they could carry on without acknowledging the many personal problems at the heart of the Stones family, while fooling around with their songs and declining to offer much insight into their career. The one question that had driven the band to make the album in the first place was the same question that was being asked after it was released. Did the Stones still matter? That's what Lester Bangs was harping on about in the 1970s. But with a more forgiving view than Bangs, I think you can only expect a pop group to create its novelty value once. Thereafter, the test for truly great bands is to regenerate periodically after periods of consolidation. Through this lens, we can see Between the Buttons as the dawning of the band's second phase after a period of rapid growth. That said, 1966-67 was a period of lateral growth and consolidation for them while retaining a lot of their critical and audience's support. By 1967, the typical Rolling Stones album that we are all now familiar with had yet to be made. With Between the Buttons, they really started making albums as an all-encompassing piece of work rather than an assembly of singles, like so many of their contemporaries. Too often, the world tries to reduce the sum of human experience to who are the winners and losers. Between the Buttons has for far too long been put in the losers column and dismissed by critics, fans, and the band itself. But having digested the complex era in which it was made, and having seen that groups that flourished during 1966-67 soon floundered as the wheel of events turned against the hopes and messages of the counterculture, the songs in Between the Buttons look more like astute and sharper critiques of their time than, let's say, Taxman or Tomorrow Never Knows. The world laid out on Between the Buttons was rapidly changing under the feet of the golden generation who bought it yet didn't get it, and even those who ignored it completely. Mick and Keith laced the album with warnings about the complacency and hyper-optimism that was taking over Britain and America, while courting those hopeful of a better world than had come into being by the middle of the 20th century. Their caution against backing the counterculture's headiest excesses did not, however, make them less reckless in their private lives. It took the Redlands drug bust to impress upon them personally that their streetwise London scepticism was more than justified when dealing with Britain's authorities and conservative press. Between the Buttons was a moment of honesty when audiences got to see how the machinery of the Rolling Stones worked, at a moment when they were struggling to impose themselves on an evolving music scene. It was an uncomfortable experience for the band and its listeners. Looking at the past outside the mood and mindset prevalent when it was released allows us to appreciate that the album is far better and more forward-looking than anyone appreciated at the time. Its twin strains of Baroque pop and proto-punk would inspire bands as far into the future as the 21st century. As Keith Richards observes in Ruby Tuesday, in life, things are always changing. What you desire to do and have achieved today doesn't matter, as every new day brings something new to contend with. Dying all the time, lose your dreams and you may lose your mind. Ain't life unkind? Keith could feel the spinning wheel of time rendering the triumph of Aftermath redundant only months after its release. The Rolling Stones made it through the mid-60s crossroads, a little banged up, but they did not lose their dream of continuing to be creative musicians. When the personal banana skins Mick, Keith and Brian slipped on during 1967 were behind them, the band came roaring back in 1968, wiser and slicker than ever. That was recording of Between the Buttons, Musical Reinvention and Keith Richards' Rises to the Occasion Part 2 by RolloGuitar, published by RJ Tosha on Patreon.